Something extraordinary happened inside Russia's most secretive air defense command center. Not a missile launch, not a radar lock, not a scrambled interceptor. What happened was far more terrifying for the men sitting at those screens. Nothing happened. Silence, a blank radar, clear sky on every display. And yet, somewhere above them, at an altitude their sensors cannot reach, at a speed their computers cannot track, wrapped inside a radio frequency signature so small it registers less than a common housefly, an American aircraft was already there, the F-47, America's newest sixth-generation fighter. A machine so far beyond anything Russia has ever seen that their most advanced air defense generals have quietly admitted to their own government what they would never say publicly. They have no answer. Not today, not in 5 years, possibly not in this decade. When you understand what the F-47 actually is, not what the press releases say, but what the engineers built, what the strategists planned, and what Russia's own classified technical assessments now confirm, you will understand why this single aircraft has fundamentally rewritten the rules of air warfare, and why Moscow is more afraid of this machine than of any nuclear threat they have faced in 30 years. Stay with me. Because this story goes much deeper than an airplane. To understand what Russia is facing, you first need to understand the world Russia thought it had already won. For 2 decades, Vladimir Putin's military planners operated on a single core assumption, that America's era of unchallenged air dominance was ending. Russia spent an extraordinary amount of its national treasure, $50 billion between 2010 and 2024 alone, building what it called an air defense architecture that would make American stealth irrelevant. The S-400 Triumph, the S-500 Prometheus, upgraded Panzer S-2 short-range systems networked into an interlocking web of radar coverage. Russia sold this architecture not just to its own military, but to China, Turkey, India, and a dozen other nations as proof that the age of American air superiority was finished. Putin's generals stood at press conferences and announced to the world that Russian radar technology had achieved something unprecedented, the ability to detect fifth-generation stealth aircraft. They claimed the S-400 could track the F-22. They claimed it could engage the F-35. Russian state television ran segment after segment, showing simulations of American stealth jets being lit up on radar displays and destroyed before they could fire a single weapon. The Russian public believed it. NATO's more nervous members worried about it. Western analysts debated it. But here's the detail that Russia's state television will never show you. Somewhere in a sealed testing facility in the Nevada desert, while Russia was building that $50 billion air defense network, American engineers were designing an aircraft that rendered every single component of it obsolete. Not by evading it, but by operating in an entirely different physical reality. One Russian aerospace engineer, speaking anonymously to a Finnish defense research publication in early 2025, described it this way. We were building the most sophisticated net in history to catch a fish, and the Americans built something that does not swim in water. That something is the F-47. Now I need you to look at a map, not of Russia, not of Ukraine, a map of physics, because what makes the F-47 untouchable is not classified software or a secret weapon system. It is the deliberate exploitation of fundamental physical limits that no radar system on Earth can overcome. Not today, not with the technology Russia currently possesses, and not with the technology Russia could realistically develop in the next 15 years. Let us start with radar cross-section. Every aircraft in history has one. It is the measurement of how much radar energy bounces back from an aircraft to the radar station trying to detect it. A Boeing 747 has a radar cross-section of roughly 100 square meters. The F-22, America's current premier stealth fighter, reduced that number to approximately 0.001 square meters, the size of a marble. The F-47 has a radar cross-section that American engineers describe only in classified documents. But independent assessments from the Royal United Services Institute in London and the Swedish Defence Research Agency, 2 of the most rigorous defense analysis organizations in the world, estimate the F-47 signature is so small it sits below the detection threshold of any existing radar system, including Russia's most advanced S-500 Prometheus network, at any tactically relevant engagement range. But that is only the first layer, and the second layer is what changes everything. The F-47 does not operate alone. This is the detail that most coverage misses entirely, and it is the most important thing you will hear in this video. The F-47 is the command node of an entirely new warfare system. It flies at the center of a constellation of AI-controlled drones, the Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, or CCA, which extend its sensor reach, absorb enemy fire, and execute attacks that the F-47 itself never needs to come close enough to perform directly. Think of it this way. Russia's air defense network was built to kill an aircraft that must fly within a certain range to drop a weapon. The F-47 never needs to enter that range. It sends autonomous wingmen instead, directing them from 300 kilometers away, beyond any radar horizon Russia possesses, and those wingmen, armed, expendable, and operating at machine speed, do what a human-piloted aircraft once had to do itself. Russia's $50 billion air defense architecture was built to answer a question that no longer needs to be asked. This is where Putin's problem stops being a military problem and starts being a civilizational one. Let me give you the numbers, because they tell a story that no amount of rhetoric can match. The F-47 program, officially designated as the next-generation air dominance platform and contracted to Boeing in March 2025 for an initial development value of $20 billion, represents the single largest investment in an individual aircraft program since the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Boeing's contract covers the development of the first operational fleet of 12 aircraft, with full-rate production planned for the early 2030s. But the $20 billion figure is only the surface number. When you add the associated collaborative combat aircraft development contracts, split between General Atomics and Anduril Industries, the total investment in the F-47 ecosystem already exceeds $47 billion. For context, that is roughly equal to Russia's entire annual defense budget for 2023, spent on a single weapon system. The performance specifications confirmed through congressional budget documents and contractor filings are staggering. The F-47 is designed to operate at altitudes above 65,000 feet, well above the engagement ceiling of the S-400 system, which tops out at approximately 40 kilometers in its most optimistic operational parameters. At cruise altitude, it operates at speeds that Russia's fastest interceptor, the MiG-31BM, could not maintain for more than 11 minutes before exhausting its fuel. The aircraft's onboard sensor suite integrates radar, infrared, and electronic intelligence collection into a single AI-managed picture that can track 300 simultaneous aerial targets, a figure that would have required an entire AWACS airborne command aircraft to achieve just 15 years ago. That sensor picture is shared in real time with the autonomous drone wingmen, with naval vessels, with ground forces, and with allied aircraft operating hundreds of kilometers away. Dr. Michael Spertus, director of the RAND Corporation's Aerospace Research Division, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in January 2026 that the F-47 does not represent an incremental improvement over fifth-generation aircraft. It represents a different category of capability that requires adversaries to rebuild their entire defensive doctrine from the ground up. Russia cannot do that, not in time. Here's why. Russia's most advanced active radar systems, the 91S6E acquisition radar that feeds the S-400, operate in the L-band and X-band frequency ranges, optimized to detect aircraft-sized objects. The F-47's shaping and materials were specifically engineered to be invisible across precisely these frequency bands. Russia's counter-answer, developing very high-frequency, or VHF, radars, comes with a fatal operational problem. VHF radar installations require several large antenna arrays spread across hundreds of meters. These installations take days to set up, are visible to satellites from orbit, and would be the first targets eliminated in any conflict, likely by those same autonomous F-47 drone wingmen operating far beyond Russian defensive coverage. Russia knows this. That is documented in the leaked conclusions of a 2024 Russian General Staff Working Group, reported by the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service in its February 2026 annual threat assessment. The Russian military's own internal conclusion: existing Russian air defense infrastructure has no technical pathway to reliable detection of this platform under realistic combat conditions. Read that again. Russia's own generals wrote it. Now, at this point, I can hear a reasonable question forming. And it is a serious question that deserves a serious answer. If the F-47 is so dominant, why has Russia not simply accelerated its own sixth-generation program to close the gap? Russia has announced its own next-generation aircraft, the Sukhoi Checkmate, designated the Su-75. Surely this represents an answer? This is where the wall of strategic reality becomes impossible to ignore. The Su-75 Checkmate was unveiled at the MAX 2021 air show with enormous fanfare. A sleek, angular single-engine design that Russian officials claimed would be in production by 2026, priced at $25 to $30 million per unit, specifically marketed as an affordable F-35 competitor for nations that cannot access American technology. It is now mid-2026. Not a single production standard Su-75 exists. The prototype shown at MAX 2021 was not a functional aircraft. It was a mock-up. It did not fly. Russian industry sources, speaking to Aviation Week's Moscow correspondent in late 2025, confirmed that the Su-75 program has been indefinitely suspended due to three compounding crises that Russia cannot solve simultaneously. The first crisis is microelectronics. The avionics systems required for a sixth-generation aircraft demand cutting-edge semiconductor fabrication at the 5-nanometer process node or below. Russia's domestic semiconductor industry cannot produce chips below 90 nanometers. Western sanctions have eliminated Russia's access to TSMC, Samsung, and every other advanced foundry capable of manufacturing the chips a modern combat aircraft requires. Russia cannot buy these chips on the open market. It cannot manufacture them at home. The second crisis is engine technology. A sixth-generation aircraft requires an adaptive cycle engine, a power plant that can shift between different operating modes to optimize fuel consumption, thrust, and heat signature simultaneously. Russia has been trying to develop such an engine, designated the AL-51, for the Su-57 fifth-generation program since 2012. It is still not operational. The AL-51 has repeatedly failed extended testing due to metallurgical failures in the turbine section, a problem rooted in Russia's inability to produce the single crystal turbine blade alloys that Western manufacturers have mastered. The third crisis is the war. Russia's defense industrial complex is currently operating every available production line at maximum capacity, just to replace the catastrophic equipment losses of the Ukraine conflict. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies' 2026 Military Balance Report, Russia has lost more than 3,200 tanks, 7,500 armored vehicles, and over 340 fixed-wing aircraft since February 2022. There is no spare industrial capacity for a revolutionary sixth-generation program. There is no spare engineering talent. Many of Russia's best aerospace engineers have emigrated. There is no spare funding. Russia's defense budget is already at 6.7% of GDP, hollowing out every other sector of the Russian economy. The Su-75 is not delayed. It is dead, and Moscow knows it. But Putin's nightmare does not stop with the F-47 itself. Because the aircraft is only one element of a strategic revolution that is encircling Russia's air power doctrine from every direction simultaneously. Let me show you how deep this goes. Alongside the F-47, the United States has deployed a system that Russia's electronic warfare community considers even more immediately threatening than the aircraft itself. The AN/ALQ-249 next-generation jammer, carried by the EA-18G Growler and now being integrated into F-35 and eventually F-47 operations, represents a generational leap in America's ability to blind, deceive, and permanently damage Russian radar networks. The NGJ does not simply jam radar signals the way Cold War-era systems did. It performs what electronic warfare specialists call cognitive jamming, using AI to analyze a radar system's operating frequency, waveform, and pulse pattern in real time, then generating a precisely tailored interference signal that is indistinguishable from the radar's own returns. To the Russian radar operator, the picture looks normal. But the picture is a lie constructed by the American jammer. Russian air defense batteries would be firing at phantom targets, while the F-47 passes through the gap between them. General Kenneth Wilsbach, commander of Pacific Air Forces, stated in a February 2026 briefing that integrated operations between the F-47, its drone wingmen, and NGJ-equipped electronic attack aircraft create what he called a layered invisibility, meaning that even if one element of the American package were somehow detected, the other elements would have already neutralized the radar doing the detecting. Russia's response? Their own EA capability, centered on the Krasuka 4 ground-based jamming system, operates on a fixed platform that is immobile, detectable from space, and which has already been successfully neutralized multiple times in Ukraine by much less sophisticated equipment than what the F-47 package brings to bear. Now look upward, because the F-47's operational picture extends to orbit. The United States Space Force's proliferated low Earth orbit satellite constellation, the Starshield military variant of the Starlink network, combined with the classified resilient GPS satellite network, provides the F-47 and its drone wingmen with navigation, targeting, and data link services that are hardened against the jamming methods Russia has spent 15 years developing. Russia's primary anti-satellite capability, the Nudal direct ascent kinetic kill vehicle, can destroy individual satellites in low Earth orbit, but it cannot destroy 2,000 satellites simultaneously. That is the number of Starshield terminals now in orbit, with 800 more planned for launch by the end of 2026. Russia's entire space warfare strategy was built around the assumption that American space architecture would remain concentrated in a small number of expensive, high-orbit satellites. That assumption is now catastrophically obsolete. The F-47 cannot be blinded from space. Its communications cannot be cut. Its navigation cannot be spoofed. Russia's information environment in a conflict scenario would be so degraded compared to America's that the outcome of any engagement would be decided before the first weapon is fired. And here is the dimension that Russia's military planners find most alarming of all. The F-47 is not just an American capability, it is an alliance force multiplier. Under the new NATO integrated air and missile defense architecture finalized at the 2025 Hague Summit, the F-47's sensor picture, its 360-degree, 300-target tracking capability, is shared in real time through encrypted data links with every NATO air defense system on the continent. A Polish Patriot battery in Rzeszów, a German Iris-T battery in Latvia, a Norwegian NASAMS installation in the Arctic. All of them received the F-47's targeting picture the moment it is generated, turning every Allied ground-based system into an extension of the aircraft's kill chain. Russia would not be facing an airplane. It would be facing a continental air defense network that thinks with one AI-assisted brain and strikes from hundreds of simultaneous positions. General Christopher Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, described this architecture in a closed NATO briefing, excerpts reported by the German newspaper Die Welt, as the first genuinely integrated air and missile defense network in NATO's history. He noted that no adversary air campaign, including one supported by Russia's full strategic bomber fleet, has a realistic prospect of survival against this layered system. But there is one final layer to this story, and in some ways, it is the most consequential of all. When Russian generals look at the F-47 program, they are not simply calculating radar cross-sections and engagement envelopes. They are confronting a more fundamental realization that the military technological gap between Russia and the United States, which Russia spent 30 years trying to close, is now wider than at any point since the 1980s and is accelerating in the wrong direction. Russia's defense industrial base is exhausted by war, crippled by sanctions, and hemorrhaging its engineering talent to emigration. America's defense industrial base, turbocharged by the CHIPS Act, the AUKUS technology sharing arrangement, and the largest sustained increase in defense R&D spending since the Reagan era, is producing breakthrough after breakthrough. A senior Russian Defense Ministry official, quoted anonymously in a December 2025 interview with the Russian opposition publication Meduza, published from its exile base in Latvia, described his country's position in words that should be read in every capital. We planned for a peer competition. What we are facing is not a peer. We are in a situation where the other side has changed the game while we were still learning the rules of the old one. That is not Western propaganda. That is a Russian official describing Russia's own strategic position to a Russian audience. There is one more dimension that most coverage overlooks entirely, and it concerns not what the F-47 does to Russia today, but what it does to the entire global arms market, and by extension, to Russia's last remaining source of strategic influence in the world. For 30 years, Russia's arms industry has been a cornerstone of its foreign policy, generating between $13 and $15 billion in annual export earnings before the Ukraine war, and creating strategic dependencies across 3 continents. When Egypt bought Russian air defense systems, it created technical dependency. When Algeria purchased Su-30 fighters, it created a training relationship. When India integrated Russian S-400 batteries, it created strategic entanglement. Arms sales were Russia's most effective tool for maintaining relevance in regions where it could no longer compete economically or culturally. The F-47's emergence is beginning to sever those relationships in a way that no amount of Russian diplomacy can reverse. Nations that have built their air defense architectures around Russian systems are now confronting an uncomfortable reality. Those systems were designed to challenge 5th-generation stealth aircraft. Against the F-47 and its ecosystem of autonomous wingmen and cognitive electronic warfare, they offer no meaningful protection. India's defense ministry, according to reports from the Delhi-based Observer Research Foundation published in March 2026, has begun a quiet but significant reassessment of its long-term procurement strategy. India's existing S-400 batteries, purchased for $543 billion in a deal that nearly triggered American CATSA sanctions, are now being evaluated against the threat environment that 6th-generation aircraft create. The internal assessment concluded that the S-400 provides inadequate coverage against the F-47 system's threat profile. India has not publicly announced a pivot away from Russian systems. But its most recent request for information documents issued to Western defense contractors in early 2026 seek 5th-generation compatible air defense capabilities, specifically Patriot, PSE-3, MSE, and NASAMS, built to network with American-architected air operations. Saudi Arabia, UAE, South Korea, Japan, Australia, nations that maintained hedged procurement strategies for decades, are now converging toward the American ecosystem. Not because of American diplomatic pressure alone, but because the technical reality is undeniable. In a world where the F-47 exists, you either operate within the network it anchors, or you operate blind and alone against it. There is one nation watching all of this more carefully than any other. One nation with the industrial capacity, the semiconductor ambitions, and the strategic motivation to actually attempt a response to the F-47. That nation is China. China's 6th-generation program, centered on what Western analysts designate as the J-36, based on imagery captured over Chengdu in late 2024, is a genuinely serious program in a way that Russia's Su-75 is not. China has functioning advanced semiconductor fabrication, having broken the 7-nanometer barrier with domestic equipment in 2024. China has the financial resources to sustain a multi-decade development program. But here is what China's engineers understand, and what the J-36 program reveals through its visible design choices. China is not trying to copy the F-47. China is trying to answer it. And that is a fundamentally different and significantly harder engineering challenge. Answering requires solving the same underlying physics problems: stealth geometry, radar-absorbing materials, adaptive propulsion, AI-managed sensor fusion, independently without the institutional knowledge base, the decades of test data, and the accumulated engineering culture that America built over 60 years of continuous development, from the SR-71 to the B-2, to the F-22, to the F-35, to the F-47. Lieutenant General S. Clinton Hinote, the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategy, stated in a 2026 wargaming report that even in the most optimistic projections for China's 6th generation development timeline, the J-36 reaches initial operational capability no earlier than 2035. And by 2035, the F-47 will have been in operational service for several years, accumulating the real-world data that China's program, starting from scratch, cannot immediately replicate. The gap between America and China is smaller than the gap between America and Russia. But in aerospace, where one generation of technological advantage translates to decisive combat outcomes, even 5 years is a chasm that can determine the outcome of a war before it begins. So what options does Russia actually have? The honest answer, the one that Russia's own strategic planners are working through in classified documents, is that the options are limited, and none of them are good. Russia can attempt to accelerate its own 6th generation program. Without the semiconductors, the engine technology, or the engineering talent, acceleration is a political statement, not a technical reality. Russia can attempt asymmetric counters, cyber attacks on ground infrastructure, anti-satellite weapons against the space layer, electronic warfare against the data links. These are real capabilities that deserve serious consideration, but they face the same fundamental problem. America anticipated them. The F-47 system was designed with the assumption that adversaries would attempt exactly these counters. The Starshield constellation's proliferated architecture defeats the kinetic anti-satellite approach. The NGJ's cognitive jamming defeats the electronic warfare counter. The aircraft's onboard autonomy means it can operate in a degraded communications environment that would cripple a less sophisticated system. Russia can attempt to use nuclear threats to deter F-47 deployment, but nuclear threats have a credibility ceiling. They work against existential conventional threats, not against the deployment of an aircraft that Russia simply cannot detect. And the use of nuclear weapons against a NATO member triggers consequences that would end Russia not as a geopolitical competitor, but as a functioning state. There is no good option. There is no clean answer. There is, in the end, only what a Russian radar operator stares at when an F-47 is in his airspace. A blank screen, silence, and the knowledge that something untouchable is already there. Let me take you back to where we started, that radar station, that blank screen, that silence. The men sitting at those displays are not incompetent. They are not poorly trained. Russia has some of the most technically sophisticated radar operators in the world, trained for decades, operating equipment that was, until very recently, genuinely among the best on Earth. But the best radar on Earth cannot detect what the F-47 is, because the F-47 was designed from the first line of code, from the first angle of its wing's geometry, from the first molecule of its surface coating, to exist in a layer of physical reality that radar, as Russia currently practices it, simply cannot reach. Vladimir Putin spent 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars building a military designed to challenge American air power. He built the S-400, he built the S-500, he built the Sukhoi Su-57 and announced it to the world as Russia's answer to the F-22. What he did not build, what he cannot build, not with the engineers he has lost, not with the semiconductors he cannot access, not with the factories currently running 24 hours a day just to replace the tanks burning in Ukrainian fields, is an answer to what Boeing just put in the sky. The F-47 is not merely an aircraft. It is the physical embodiment of a strategic truth that Russia's leadership is only now being forced to confront. That the era in which Russia could credibly contest American air dominance is over, and that no amount of press conference announcements, state television graphics, or political bluster changes what appears, or more precisely, what does not appear, on those radar screens in Moscow. There is no answer. And the silence on that radar display is the loudest thing Russia has heard in a generation. Thank you for watching. If this analysis reached you, please like the video and share it. Geopolitical reality deserves to be understood as clearly as possible. At TGN, we will continue to follow the global balance of power as it shifts beneath the feet of those who thought they controlled it.